Good morning. I'm so glad you could be with me today in God's Word and the Unfolding the Word series. As you know, we're in the midst of the study of the book of Daniel. Today we open up the 6th chapter. I'm going to be reading verses 1 to 3 in this opening part of chapter 6. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other presidents and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Now, as you remember, Chapter 5 into chapter 6 represents a major change chronologically. Babylon, the empire of Babylon, of which Nebuchadnezzar was the premier focus, has now ended. The final king, Belshazzar, is killed. The Medo-Persian Empire has now come on the scene. Chapter 5, in fact, focused on the very last day of the Babylonian Empire. The one clear picture we have of what was happening on that final night. Babylon is defeated. Belshazzar and all of his nobles have been killed, with the exception of the most recent noble, Daniel, who had been elevated, despite his protest of not wanting it, to third in that empire, even though the empire itself was disintegrating. The empire has now changed. The timing and framework of the unfolding of history is shifted exactly like God had predicted, because he is the Lord of history, you remember. That is one of the underlying themes throughout the book of Daniel. God is the one in charge of history. History is unfolding according to his plan. The people who are in positions of power are there because of God's purposes. Doesn't mean those people are good people, or that they're living in accordance with his rules and regulations, but it does mean God is superintending it, and that history is in his hands. He knows the end from the beginning, and he is working out his purposes within it. Just as the chapter 2 dream first sent to Nebuchadnezzar, just as it had predicted, the head of gold, Babylon, has now been replaced by the chest and arms of silver, the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, within this new empire that has now come on the scene, Darius the Mede rules the province of Babylon on behalf of Cyrus, the overall emperor of the Medo-Persians. The position of ruler over the province of Babylon, which included the capital city and the region surrounding it, that was given as a reward to the Medes for helping the Persians in this warfare that has finally been finished. They've captured now the former Babylonian Empire. The Medes, I shared with you before that the Medes and the Persians together were a mixed kingdom that together became the replacement empire. Darius, it tells us, was 62 years old by the standards of the world. That's how chapter 5 ended. Darius is moved into position of leadership even at his more advanced age. Now, we know some things about Darius because of secular history. We know, for example, that Darius, being 62 years old when this empire shift occurs and he's moved into the kingship over the Babylonian province, that meant that Darius would have been 39 at the time of Nebuchadnezzar's death, which was 23 years preceding the death of Belshazzar and the end of the kingdom. We also know from historical writings and records of the time that the Darius was appointed as the representative of the Medes to the very court of Nebuchadnezzar. He was their representative in Babylon at that particular period of time. We see secular historical affirmation of that truth. Now, what is the point of my developing that history lesson for you? Well, the point of it is that in the court of Nebuchadnezzar, which Darius, as the representative of the Mede, would have been at, it would have been impossible for him not to be aware of Daniel, because you remember Daniel was still in the position of power in Babylon during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. He would have been exposed more than likely to Daniel, certainly would have heard about him, certainly probably even knew him. And to know Daniel is to be impressed with Daniel because of the way God had worked in his life and his faithfulness and surrender to the purposes of God in his life. I would suspect that this is the reason that Daniel was the one noble and ruler of the Babylonian Empire was not killed when the Babylonian Empire ended and Belshazzar lost the city, the capital city. At any rate, we get into the 6th chapter and we find out that Darius has decided to put Daniel into the new leadership structure. You know, it's a change of empire, change of structures, new governing authority. He clearly was respecting Daniel. It's interesting to me that the time that he does this for Daniel is the same year number 1 of the Medo-Persian Empire's control. It was the same year that the Emperor Cyrus made his famous decree to restore the Jews to Judea. Remember, they'd been 70 years in exile in the midst of Babylon, as God's disciplinary hand was on the people in Nebuchadnezzar, and the Babylonians were part of that tool of discipline. God was moving in the heart of Cyrus as the emperor, and the God that we serve was also moving in the heart of Darius as the king over that sub-province of the Medo-Persian Empire. He was working in both to achieve his purposes. He was working in Cyrus to get the permission for the Jews to return after the 70 years. He was working in Darius to get Darius to appoint Daniel into a position of leadership over Babylon and the region surrounding Babylon, which is where the majority of the Jews would have been. So that now the one in charge of that region to facilitate the return of the Jews was Daniel. God is at work in the history. God is at work in unfolding his plan. Daniel's promotion at this late age in his life, we'll look at it a little bit more tomorrow, but he was in his 80s, his early 80s at this point. Daniel's promotion put him in the perfect place to assist his people in returning from exile, to get them supplied and facilitated, perhaps even guarded, so that they could work their way back to Jerusalem and Judea. God's plans are always so amazing and so in place that you have to, in hindsight, recognize he's always been in control. He's always had a plan unfolding, even though at the time we don't necessarily understand that plan, or even now understand it perfectly. But what we do understand is that God is an active God engaged in this world, ensuring that his plans unfold. Now, as Daniel is elevated into this position in this first year of Darius's reign, of the Medo-Persian Empire's overall control, understand that it was at this very time that God was answering a core prayer of Daniel. Later on in chapter 9 of Daniel, which is a part of Daniel in which there's prophecies being given and retrospective on different times, listen to these verses 1 to 3. In the first year of Darius, this is what we're talking about now, he said, by descent of Mede, he was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years that, according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, must pass before the end of the desolation of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. And then I turned my face to the Lord, asking him by prayer and pleas for mercy with fasting and sackcloth and ashes. In other words, Daniel had been praying for this very restoration. He understood the timetable. He knew he was in the midst of it, and he was expecting God. Humbly, of course, but expecting God to be at work. It's this restoration that we read about in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verses 22 to 23, where we read, "And now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, that it might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all of his people, may the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up." We read the same summary in the beginning of the book of Ezra. All right? It is time to return from exile. God has moved to put Daniel in a position of leadership to assist this. He's moved in the heart of Cyrus of Darius. Daniel is assisting, but let me end today by saying, remember, Daniel himself was not able to go back to Judah. He'd been serving in exile all of this time, taken away as a young teenager, but it was not God's plan to move him back to Jerusalem, which had to be the desire of his heart, but that wasn't God's plan. Well, join me tomorrow as we continue to examine this new era in the life of Daniel and in the unfolding of God's plan of history. God bless.